Thanks very much, Jim and Richard, for that extremely kind introduction. I wish my mother were still alive to have heard it. I think she would have been surprised. But I'm very happy to be with you, if only in pixels. And I appreciate very much the society allowing me to be virtual. I know I personally would have preferred being in Wales with you and participating and meeting so many of the scientists in the society. It's a singular honor to present the John Dunster lecture. I knew John back in the day through Unscare and also through ICRP, and he was always one of my favorite individuals and an inspiration. The title of my presentation is Hearts and Minds, New Frontiers in Radiation Protection, perhaps. And the presentation will just be a little bit longer than Darren's 5K time, but it shouldn't be too long. So thanks very much. And if we, as they say, roll the tape. Thanks very much. It's a great privilege for me to be with you today and to present the John Dunster Lecture. It's a special pleasure because I knew and worked with John for quite a number of years, beginning in the early 1990s. This is through our cooperations and collaborations with Unscare, ICRP, and even with visits to NRPB. I met him in 1994 at Unscare in Vienna, and I have a brief story. It was common back then to have a formal, semi-formal dinner with the UK and the USA delegations with the Unscare delegates, or Unscare Secretariat. We went to the special dining room, and John came up to me, and I had just met him briefly, and he pointed to my collar and said, "Bad form." He had a twinkle in his eye, but I had no idea what he was talking about. And then he had to explain to me that in proper circumstances, such as these formal dinners with Unscare, it is appropriate to wear a white shirt. Everyone around me had a white shirt. I'm from Texas, and I was wearing my best brand new light blue button-down shirt. And he made it known to me that that wasn't at that time appropriate. For the next several decades, I always had a white shirt on in recognition of this gentle reminder of how to act and perform properly. And today, I have a white shirt on in John's honor. He was just a wonderful individual, a remarkable intellect, a very quick wit, and he was fun to be around. And for the many social engagements that we had over the years, it was enjoyable to meet with him and his wife, Rose. So my title today is Hearts and Minds and what it means for radiation protection. And I'm going to cover briefly these 5 topics. I'll give a background for the million-person study, then talk about leukemia, heart, minds with Parkinson's disease, and then a future. Why another study? We know that radiation does cause cancer and leukemias. There's many studies over the last 100 years showing that radiation is a carcinogen. But the major gap in understanding is what's the effect when you receive exposures gradually over time, such as in occupational or environmental circumstances. And we need to have more information on this risk from low dose rate continuous exposures or fractionated exposures so that we can accurately estimate risks related to medicine with the increased exposures to the population with imaging, to accidents or terrorist events, or even in this unthinkable circumstance that we have now in the Ukraine and the Russian invasion on the possible use of nuclear weapons in that circumstance. We need to have more understanding about occupational exposures, environmental exposures, living around nuclear facilities or legacy sites. And then with the increase in high altitude travel and space travel, there's a need for greater understanding on the effects of chronic low dose exposures. So why are we studying 1 million radiation workers? And the answer is pretty simple. It's for statistical power, or the ability to address any health effects had they occurred. And this is particularly important when we're looking at effects at relatively low doses. And then the ability to evaluate rare cancers, perhaps quantifying the risk of small intestines and other cancers that are not well studied because they're so rare. A big gap in our understanding is the effects of intakes of radionuclides. These highly T exposures to various exposure to organs, not just the lung, but the bone and to the brain, from plutonium, uranium, polonium, americium, and so on. What are the differences in those between men and women? Differences other than the sex organs, breast versus prostate. And then we have the ability to look at all conditions and not just cancer mortality. And we're now embarking upon dementia, cognition, cerebrovascular disease, in addition to cardiovascular disease. What does 1 million people look like? Here's a million people that came to visit the Pope in 2015 in Philadelphia. It's a huge number. We're studying 1 million workers. We have, for every single one of them, all their demographic characteristics with regard to age, sex, and socioeconomic status. We have their dosimetry characteristics and scenarios. We have their outcome characteristics with regard to mortality, and now we're moving into incidence. It's over 30 cohorts that are put together called the 1 Million Person Study, but it's been ongoing for 25 years, and it's a relatively, you can imagine, enormous undertaking. Who's being studied? Here's the 1 million. Manhattan Project workers from the Department of Energy, such as Los Alamos and Hanford. Atomic veterans are nuclear weapons test participants, nuclear power plant workers, industrial radiographers, medical workers. New additions have been nuclear submariners going back to 1954 with the Nautilus, and now we've reactivated the radiant dye painter study, where the last epidemiologic follow-up was in 1980, and at that time, 60% of the population was still alive. It's important to recognize that we have a large number of women in the 1 Million Person Study. Women are not that well studied in occupational circumstances, and we have over 160,000, which can be compared with the LSS, the Atomic Bomb Survivor Study of adult women, which is just about 30,000. Here's a bonus coverage. We are studying and have just studied the girls of the Atomic City. These were made popular in this novel by Kiernan, and they include the Calutron girls, the women separating uranium-235 with mass spec. We studied 13,000 women, practically all of them have died, and over 600 lung cancers. The dose distribution to the lung is broad, up to a gray, and the female exposures were greater than the male exposures because they work longer in these job occupations. The dose response for lung cancer, assuming a dose weighting factor of 1 and not providing any quality factor or radiation weighting factor, is remarkably flat. Dosimetry is the key to good epidemiology. Throughout the years, we've stressed and put the highest priority on getting the best doses possible for the workers being studied. We have a cookbook, Deriving Organ Doses and Their Uncertainties for Epidemiologic Study, a report 178, which is headed up by Andre Rouville, which describes how we are conducting the dosimetric approaches to this diverse set of populations that we're dealing with. Medicine is particularly difficult with medical workers, as you can imagine. And do you know what the key problem we had to deal with when we have over 100,000 medical workers under study? It was the use and wearing of lead aprons, and clearly that would affect organ doses. And so we had a special commentary focusing on medical workers. And now the new frontier is that we're dealing with intakes of radionuclides, the plutoniums and poloniums, uraniums. And with Rich Leggett and Keith Eckerman, we've developed new kinetic and anatomical models for brain dosimetry following intakes of radionuclides. This was just recently published this past month as an NCRP commentary. Well, dosimetry is critical for good epidemiology. It's just not needed, it's critical. Without good dosimetry, the epidemiologic studies are not that informative. We have looked at spent a lot of time doing dosimetry for our nuclear weapons test participants, and even made the cover of Radiation Research, and did biodosimetry, and took bloods from our atomic vets who were exposed at the Bravo site in 1954, some 60 years ago. I mentioned we reactivated the radium worker study, and we have a scientific committee, NCRP, looking at all aspects of dosimetry from radium-226, 228, and looking at all organs, not just the bone, but for the lung, the sinuses, the breast, that all might be related to the radium and external exposures received. As you all know, one of the hottest topics in radiation protection and potential standard setting is what's the risk to the heart, cardiovascular disease. And so we at NCRP are now embarking on a much larger evaluation of doses to portion segments of the heart from external radiation, but also from intakes of radionuclides. Well, to be able to do all this, we require funding, and the United States has been very supportive of our efforts. The logo size is directly proportional to the amount of contributions to the million-person study over the years. Our current supporters are NASA, Department of Energy, and the Nuclear Navy. And also, I'll just mention for those that are following the National Academy of Sciences and the low-dose radiation acts being passed by our Congress, that's all a focus with the Office of Science. Our funding comes from the Office of Environmental Health, Safety, and Security, which is a bit different. The National Cancer Institute was also very influential in getting us where we are. Now the overview of results. It's not blood, sweat, and tears, but it's leukemia, then hearts, and then minds. Why discuss leukemia in this topic of new frontiers? Well, I wanted to make sure that you were aware of our findings with leukemia in the over 500,000 workers study. We all know that leukemia is caused by radiation. It's the hallmark of radiation, and it's been found by many investigators over the last 100 years in many different countries. So in our study, the thought was we better demonstrate that there is a risk from these chronic exposures, or we should. It would be remarkable if we don't, so that then when I start discussing heart disease and neurological disease, you'll have some feeling and perhaps some understanding of the substance of these reports. So here's new leukemia, non-CLL, among our nuclear power plant workers. We had 135,000 workers so studied. It's low LET. The mean dose is about 40 milligray. The dose response to the active bone marrow is about a gray. Almost complete follow-up. We're able to do practically 99% follow-up of all workers in the United States due to our remarkable systems and approaches. Only a few percentage were female, and there was 303 leukemias evaluated. Clear evidence for dose response, statistically significant with an excess relative risk of 0.15. We then looked at our industrial radiographers, a very similar cohort that was identified from the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission records, as well as the Landauer Dosimetry Company. We had almost the same numbers of dose response up to a gray, a little follow-up, 10% females, and we had almost a comparable dose response as the nuclear power plant workers, an excess relative risk of 0.12 per 100 milligray. Then one of the values of the million-person study will be our ability to combine these various cohorts at the end of the day and get very precise estimates of risk. Here's a pooling of the nuclear power industrial radiographers. We have 250,000 workers, and then when we put everything together, we get a significant dose response, not surprising, with for leukemia. This is a forest plot in a meta-analysis of 8 of our cohorts to date. And the overall estimate of risk from these 8 cohorts, which involved 500,000 workers, is 0.87 excess relative risk per 100 milligray. It's based on 1,600 deaths due to leukemia. This is the forest plot, and indicates that practically all of the studies, the smaller ones and the low doses, have wider confidence intervals, but they're now consistent in this meta-analysis, which was conducted for us by Linda Walsh. Many of you know her, University of Zurich, and her many contributions to radiation science. Here's a summary. Not surprising, chronic exposures is associated with leukemia. Statistical improvements will come from the ongoing follow-up of the other 500,000 person study workers and the extended follow-up of those that we previously studied. What are the implications for radiation protection? Well, stay tuned, and we'll see whether there's strong evidence to arise whether the risks are lower, higher, or the same for specific cancers and all cancers taken together in the million-person study. That was blood, now going into hearts. This is now sort of a similar pattern of what I've just shown you. Nuclear power plant workers, everything's about the same, 135,000. And note over the LSS and the group that had the dosimetry, it was 86,000 total, men, women, and children. And so our individual studies are larger, although the dose distribution is not as broad as among the survivors of the Japanese atomic bombings. Here, what is to note is that we have many more outcomes. 5,000 deaths due to ischemic heart disease. The dose response is remarkably flat, no evidence for an increased risk. For the ischemic heart disease and industrial radiographers, almost exactly the same as seen with the power plant workers. Flat dose response, no evidence for an increased risk. And these are with 4,000 deaths, and the estimates of doses are, in large part all below a half a gray, 500 milligray. We're able to pool them again, not surprisingly. When you pool 250,000 workers with similar results, you get similar results, but narrower confidence bounds, and again, no evidence for an increased risk of ischemic heart disease over this range that can go up to a half a gray, and based on 10,000 cases. Here's our forest plot in our meta-analysis. Our meta-analysis is based on 7 of the million-person study cohorts, over 500,000 workers and 32,000 deaths, and there's no evidence at all for a statistical increase of ischemic heart disease. Here's a summary. Well, based on the 500,000 workers studied in the United States using the same methodologies with the same approach for follow-up, the same approach for dosimetry, all conducted by the same investigators using the same protocols and actually following a published protocol, and based on the 32,000 deaths, there is little to no evidence that chronic exposures are associated with ischemic heart disease under half a grade. What's the implications for radiation protection? If confirmed by the additional 500,000 workers we're studying now, ischemic heart disease really should not be considered in a system of radiological protection. There seems to be little evidence that it would actually be a stochastic effect, particularly when we're talking about exposures under 500 milligrade, under half a grade. Blood, hearts, and now into minds. The NCRP has been working with NASA for 20 to 30 years, providing guidance on space radiation and protection of the astronauts. Also, with the plans to embark on long missions outside of Earth orbit, particularly to Mars, there is a concern that's been based on rodent experiments, quite a number of them, that dementia, cognitive impairment can arise based on exposure to simulated galactic cosmic rays in the lab. These are in particular in the Brookhaven National Laboratory. These are particularly of a concern are the really high energy and heavy ion exposures, such as iron, that come from the throughout space and from the explosion of supernova. Because of this concern, NASA's concern is that they don't want to have any cognitive impairment and want to know what the limits are that would cause the mission to fail. And the other thing, a bit facetiously, is when the astronauts come back from their journey, they should know where they were and not experience early onset dementia. NASA asked us to convene a committee to make recommendations with regard to CNS evaluations that would be useful for their space program. And here's a committee, very exceptional one, and included a few Englishmen, Dudley Goodhead, and then John Hopewell, too, were on the committee. And the recommendation was that workers with intakes of radionuclides that expose brain tissue to high LET alpha particles, helium nuclide, they could be studied and should be studied for late effects, including cognitive function and dementia. And studies were then initiated of workers exposed to polonium, radium, plutonium, uranium, and americium. Well, at that time, NASA and NCRP and the medical study were only interested in high LET exposures because there was no evidence that low LET exposures were possibly related to neurodegenerative diseases. And the ABOM data, from the Adult Health Survey, they had actually published on dementia and cognitive function and found no evidence at all for low LET exposures to be related to dementia and cognition. Then we're rather surprised just 2 years ago when our colleagues conducting the MIAC worker studies came out with this study showing a clear dose response for Parkinson's disease of all things, and there was a dose response over up to 3 Gray, and this was by our colleague Tamar Azazova, and I read that and I looked at it, and then I thought of a British term, and one that I like to use every once in a while. I looked at it and said, rubbish. I'm skeptical of most people's work, including my own, but that just didn't make sense. So I took it upon myself, I'm going to write a quick letter to the International Journal of Epidemiology with real data from our American workers. And so I'm going to look at the nuclear power plant workers and say, I'm going to publish this and show that, in fact, this MIAC worker study was rubbish. Well, you can imagine my surprise when the dose response is almost exactly the same as the MIAC workers over a lower dose period, even that we did have doses up to about 1 Gray to the brain and in our nuclear power plant study. Rather remarkable. This took us into a different realm, a different area of concern that we had not thought about before. And NASA was so interested in the low LET studies that they funded us for another 5 years to look at it more carefully within our 1 million-person study. Here's a bit about Parkinson's disease. I'm a cancer epidemiologist, and I know very little about, knew very little about neurological diseases, and now I've learned quite a bit. But here's a snapshot overview. It's very common. Parkinson's disease is very common, second only to Alzheimer's. In fact, the world has experienced a pandemic, and that increases in practically all countries are occurring over the last calendar years. The risk of Parkinson's disease increases with age. Not really known what the causes are. It's multifactorial. Genetics clearly plays a role, and environmental factors likely, such as some pesticides. And one of the remarkable features that we've known for 40 years is that cigarette smoking protects against Parkinson's disease. I mean, this has been seen time and time again. It's remarkable. Cigarette smoking, if you don't smoke a lot, you have a high risk of Parkinson's. If you smoke a lot, you have a low risk of Parkinson's. This was reinforced just a year or so ago with the very substantial and famous British a physician study that Sir Richard Dahl and his colleagues had set up many years ago looking at smoking. And so they published a paper only on Parkinson's and confirmed that those physicians that smoked a lot had a low risk of Parkinson's. They also had a very high risk of lung cancer. And those physicians that didn't smoke much at all, I'm sure maybe I missed that up. If you didn't smoke at all, you had a high risk of Parkinson's and a low risk of lung cancer. If you smoked a lot, you had a high risk of lung cancer and a low risk of Parkinson's. Rather remarkable. And now we're going to be looking at ionizing radiation. Well, I showed you the nuclear power plant workers, and here's now the industrial radiographers. Almost the same, based on 128 deaths, almost the same positive dose response that these low dose fractionated exposures are associated with Parkinson's. We looked at our medical workers, 100,000 doses to the brain up to a gray, and half of them are women, females, and we get not a statistically convincing dose response, but a similar dose response as seen in the other two large studies. We put these three together, and it's 367,000 workers. And when we put the three together, they're all conducted in a similar fashion. We get a statistically significant increase in association with Parkinson's related to fractionated radiation doses. As an aside, I want to mention this early study we did of our Mound workers in Ohio. At Mound, they produced the polonium beryllium triggers that were used to detonate the Trinity bomb, the first bomb, and then the Nagasaki, and then other plutonium bombs. So the workers had detectable levels of polonium, not fatal doses. And we had tens of thousands of bioassays on polonium and looked at organ doses to the brain and lumped all the neurological diseases together to look for dose response. We couldn't do Parkinson's disease, so the numbers were so small, but there was a suggestive evidence that all these dementias and Alzheimer's, motor neuron diseases was associated with radiation. It needs to be determined, numbers are a bit small. But I also mentioned this because polonium, as many of you know and perhaps involved, was the poison for Litvinenko, the Russian dissident spy who was killed, assassinated, with less than a microgram of polonium. It was rather, remarkable. This is the first time I had seen an LD-100, and it was in 25 days, and Litvinenko died a horrible, terrible death where the polonium went to every soft tissue in his body. The models, the biokinetic models that we had developed at Mound and also at Rocketdyne and previously by Keith Eckerman and Rich Leggett were actually used by Scotland Yard and Health Protection England to assess what the intakes for Litvinenko were, and I understand the models were quite accurate. The autopsy findings were also most interesting in that there was clear evidence that polonium did go to the brain as well as to the heart and other organs. Here's the meta-analysis of the Parkinson's disease, not counting the combined ones, and statistically significant evidence with a beta estimate of analysis estimate of 0.185, at 100 milligray and statistically significant. What's remarkable, I can't remember ever seeing a forest plot or any studies that I've done where we've had this consistency like this. It's just as amazing. It's something totally unexpected and surprising. Well, what's a summary? Well, based on 500,000 workers and 1,400 deaths, chronic exposures were associated with a statistically significant increased risk of Parkinson's. What's the implication for radiation protection? Well, quick answer is I wish I knew. But here, if this is confirmed by the additional 500,000 workers under study and with our linkages with the healthcare system in the United States, our CMS or Medicare and Medicaid registries will be able to obtain incidence and then other potential confounding factors that would be related to Parkinson's, and we'll be able to evaluate actual cognition tests that have been taken by many tens of thousands of the million-person workers. And we are considering epigenetic evaluations with blood studies of aging and cognition impairment. But it'll just be fascinating to put all this together and to be involved in this new frontier on how neurogenetic disease might be considered in a system of radiation protection when we have absolutely no understanding of radiation mechanisms. It's clear not a DNA effect, that's for sure, and somehow messing up the synapses or communications or whatever. How actually would that be considered? Conclusions, our findings to date. Chronic exposures cause leukemia. Not surprising. Chronic exposures below 0.5 gray do not cause ischemic heart disease. This is based on our million-person study. Chronic exposures are associated with Parkinson's disease, a new finding with complex implications in terms of systems of radiation protection. And then further follow-up and information will come when we combine our other studies of low LET and high LET intakes. If in fact you came in late and missed some of the presentations and were actually particularly interested in any aspects, this April special issue of IJRB was devoted entirely to the million-person study, 24 peer-reviewed articles giving reviews, our methods. If you're interested in dosimetry, this is how we did it, and then 8 original articles with the findings. The editors were particularly helpful putting this all together, Andre Ville once again, and then another Englishman, Richard Wakeford, who has been a constant help and inspiration throughout our research and radiation protection discussions. Here's our future. Well, it's not the end, but it's perhaps the end of the beginning. We continue to follow up each of these cohorts again and again. 500,000 or 450,000 are still alive. There's a lot more to learn. We're going to include the new studies, and particularly the radium doppelgangers and our submariners. We also have large populations of workers exposed to neutrons, so we're going to try to tease that out. Wonderful opportunities for biologically based monitoring using adverse outcome pathway approaches. As NCRP has now had 2 publications on how this might be done. Biologically focused studies, epigenetics, DNA methylation studies, looking at interactions with genetic susceptibilities are all on the horizon. And then our linkages with Medicare are just remarkable. We'll be able to get incidence data, smoking data, cofactor information, body mass index. This is going to be an issue of big data. We're also, working. We'll have over 1 billion. We'll have over 1 billion data points. We'll need cluster computing right now. We have teams working at Kansas State University, trying to put all this stuff together. When you have 1 million people and you have hundreds of variables for each one of them, how do you analyze it? And then, we'll be able to provide additional evidence in the evaluation of the appropriateness of the LNT model for radiation protection, not for radiation risk assessment, but for radiation protection. We have a vision to create a national center for radiation epidemiology and biology. The epidemiology is pretty well covered, and we're looking for ways to expand the biology. We also are seeking collaborators. We want to contribute to this fueling the future with skilled research. We definitely need radiation professionals to address future challenges throughout the world with this expanding and continued use and continued concern about radiation throughout the world. There's over 100 people that are engaged in the 9-person study, and they're actively engaged today. Here are those in their organizations, a snapshot. Larry Dower in particular, Memorial Sloan Kettering, he'll be taking on the mantle as the principal investigator for the 9-person study within the year. We have researchers at University of Zurich, Vanderbilt, Brown University, Oak Ridge National Lab, Oak Ridge Associated University, Risk Assessment Corporation, those of you that know John Till and Harold Beck, the Landauer Corporation, at least in years past, and of course NCRP. And then I have to appreciate and recognize again, without the funding, the current funding today from NASA, DOE, and the US Navy, this research would not continue. And we don't need a lot to continue studying established cohorts, but it's important for us to have continued funding. Last comment, there are unlimited opportunities for scientific innovation, biologically based modeling, ensemble modeling, supercomputing, training professionals for the future challenges we face in the world. And there are new opportunities that haven't yet been recognized. For example, when we started, we had not a clue that Parkinson's disease might be an issue. So we're flexible and we can change with the times, and we are limited only by our imagination. Well, again, thanks very much, Society for Radiological Protection, allowing me to speak on behalf of my friend and super colleague, John Dunster, and it's great to be part of this series that has lectured, that honors him.
Wow, okay, there's a lot of questions here. But let's just start with questions from the audience. Any questions here? We have roving microphones. Any questions? Just one there, yeah.
Hi, John. Hi, John. It's Roger Coates here. Great to see you and great to listen to you. Looking at the data that you presented there, compared to modern day practice, many of the doses that go into epidemiology studies are quite large. And what is of particular interest, I think, nowadays is what are the effects of doses around the really low dose region, a few millisieverts or a few millisieverts a year, particularly around the level of natural background, etc. So if you look into your crystal ball and try and project forward over the next few years, do you have any feel for what evidence might come out of studies, both biological and epidemiology, that give information on that very low dose region? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Roger. Good to see you. Good to hear you. With regard to the epidemiology, it's pretty straightforward. There's not going to be anything that will provide good estimates of risk, in the millisievert range, even at 10 millisieverts. I'd be very surprised. It's possible in a few small subsets, such as newborns or children, where there is perhaps an increased sensitivity with large enough numbers in control of confounding. But what happens that, the effects that you're trying to detect epidemiologically, they're so low. So that you need 1 million people or high doses just to get a sense of being statistical ability to detect anything. Then the other problem, epidemiology, we're just observational. We play the hands that were dealt us. It's not experimental. There's so much uncertainty in all the ways in which the studies are conducted. So there's this huge uncertainty, epidemiologic uncertainty, when you get at lower and lower doses and smaller, measures of effect. So it's going to be really problematic. I don't think it'll be done. It can be done to detect, epidemiologically risks at 1 millisievert, even 10 millisieverts. But what we do, we say, well, we look at the pattern of risk. That's our fallback. As well, we find something at 200, we find something at 100. Gee, look, we're finding something at 50. Maybe, and look, the pattern is the same, and so our estimates of the risk at these lower levels are more realistic, or not. With regard to the, it's very exciting with the biologically based modeling, and so much is being done, I know, in Europe as well as in the United States, is that if we can learn more about the mechanisms and the pathways, and then get away from just this, the epidemiology, how good are our models? We're going to fit a straight line, a spline model, or a linear model and a quadratic model, but then trying to bring some biological understanding to complement the good epidemiology. We might have better understanding, in my view, of what the risk might be, or could very well be at these very low doses, which all of us are concerned about. And the other thing I think is really important to understand is that radiation doesn't cause, I'll say it doesn't cause all cancers, but it certainly doesn't cause all cancers of the same magnitude. So there are some cancers that you really require very high doses, or the evidence is not that clear. I think of prostate cancer, cervical cancer, bone cancer, so that, at the low doses, one's not going to be able to detect anything, for certain sets of cancers. So one model, and even this model that we use for radiation protection, where we lump all, or combine, I shouldn't use the word lump, when we combine the cancers together, we're combining cancers with diverse etiologies and sensitivities. And so it perhaps has some good with regard to radiation protection from the population that was being studied. It's not that biologically sound. So thanks for the question.
Any other questions? Yes, Chris.
Thank you very much for your talk, John. I'm Chris Ferguson, I'm Director of Science and Technology for SRP. My question is, would there be any value in extending your study to, for example, European workers? You might get up to the 2 million person study doing something like that. Or would we be getting into the law of diminishing returns against complexity of the studies?
Excellent question. And we've, to date, our focus has been with U.S. workers, and that was the way that we were able to get additional, funding from the United States agencies and everything, just to focus on the U.S. However, we do believe that sometime in perhaps the near future, it would be very advantageous and valuable to combine with several of the European studies. One of the issues that, is the comparability of the epidemiology and the dosimetry that's being done for the studies. In all of these, the 30 cohorts we're doing in the United States, everything's done the same way. The follow-up is the same way. The dosimetry is the same way. It's done by the same people. The epidemiology, it's the same. It may not be the best way, but it's all consistent, and together, and there's no issues of, heterogeneity based on the methods being different. So one of the things that would be an issue would be, and if you look at some of the European studies and, the large cohorts, such as in InWorks, there are many cohorts in different countries with different techniques that were used, and they've done a marvelous job putting it together. But how it might be combined with ours, that would have to be determined. On the other hand, I think the NRRW study, the ones that have been conducted over the years by the United Kingdom, Sarah Darby and Colin Muirhead, and now the Gillies and others right now, that would be appealing because they're, although there's not a good evaluation of internal intakes of radionuclides, there's a lot of systematic similarities between our studies. So that, once we embark upon getting, I like your argument, if 1 million is good, 2 million should be better, as long as the 2 million is the same similar quality. And the UK study would be, of the radiation workers would be quite appealing.
Okay, another question? This one. Oh, yeah.
Thank you, John. In your talk, you mentioned that the actual mechanisms for the onset of Parkinson's are not very well understood. So I wondered how we might, would it be possible to discern whether or not the correlation between radiation exposure and the onset of Parkinson's was a correlation or causative?
That's, we call it the $64,000 question. That's a key question. And it's clearly a correlation. And it's just not clear to me on the biological, mechanisms. And one of the curiosities, or the peculiarities with this correlation, we now have the correlation with the radiation and low LAT. We've got it with the Russian studies and then practically all of our studies. That's rather remarkable. But also when we look at our studies and we look at smoking, and this is, to me, nobody knows, and this has been around for 40 years, nobody has a clear understanding about why smoking protects. And so we look at our populations, like in the military, enlisted men and officers. Enlisted men smoke a lot. They have incredibly low risk of Parkinson's. Excuse me. Officers don't smoke hardly at all. They have a very high risk of Parkinson's. We look at we have other measures of smoking, actual smoking, and also surrogates of smoking, and the pattern is seen in all our studies. And so then you just sort of think about it. Well, how could all these, so there's correlations with cigarette smoking, that cigarette smoking protects, and not smoking, that's the other thing, gets you at higher risk. How can radiation, does radiation, affect could hit the cells that produce the dopamine, and there could, one could sit here and hypothesize, but I think this is where the brilliance it would be for people out there is to think of a good way to test, the hypotheses on what could a biological mechanism be that radiation could result in this this disease. And Parkinson's, as you know, it's a very, it's not curable. It's a very serious disease. It always gets progressively worse. And the diagnosis, particularly for serious disease and cause of death, it's pretty serious. And that, given the pandemic of Parkinson's in the world today, if in fact radiation was possibly, causally related as opposed to a correlate of something else, like smoking, is that a correlate of something else? That's an incredibly important question. And I'm sorry, I don't have a good idea on how it could be tested or evaluated.
Thanks, John. I think we do have obviously a number of questions that are being submitted in writing through the Q&A function. And if you don't mind, John, we will submit these questions to you after this. And if you could then reply to them, we can then post them on the website. So you'll have the answers that John can provide to those questions that have been posted through the Q&A. I do have one question, if I can use my prerogative as chair, to ask right now, and that is, do you foresee extending this research to, say, other organ-specific diseases, such as liver disease?
Definitely. That's we're going to look at everything. And just liver disease, liver cancer, cirrhosis, cerebral, the the issues are unlimited or the outcomes are unlimited. And I'll just briefly mention, we have this ability to access our Medicare and Medicaid files from 1999 on. This is our billing. It's not set up for epidemiology, but we've used it at Vanderbilt before. We get all outcomes, incident outcomes. We get correlates. We get body mass index. We get smoking, whether all these people actually smoke, not surrogates of smoking. We'll get, diagnoses of Parkinson's. We'll get Alzheimer's. We'll get cognitive test scores where people have to take a test when they get into a nursing home. We'll have, this is where I was mentioning, we'll have 1 billion data points, and we're working with cluster computing and supercomputers, things that are just way beyond, my understanding of just 20 years ago, what was possible. So that was sort of the last thing, in my slides. We're limited only by our imagination, and that we're also looking out, for good ideas, good collaborators, people with ideas. We're amassing a large number of data sets and possibilities. We're giving our data, or sharing our data sets with doctoral students so they could use them for the research. We're very keen on what you've mentioned, Jim, several times, is we need to attract young scientists for the future. We need to get them excited about radiation protection and radiation science. We then get them excited, get them engaged, and then we need to retain them. And we need to retain them with good jobs, good quality, and then, financial jobs for them, and whatever that might be. Yeah, and we're hoping, we just had our first doctoral student at Vanderbilt in radiation epidemiology. So we've got a small start, and we're trying to do that, is attract young people and engage them and keep them in the field.
Fantastic. So thank you again, John, for the Dunster Lecture this year, and we'll give you a